Yeah.
Either way. They're bad. Okay. My name is Audrey Dowling. I'll be the first speaker for the government team today, strongly affirming the resolution that the United States federal government should abolish the Senate. So we believe all definitions are contextual, but just in case, the Senate is one of the houses in the bicameral legislature that the United States currently has. It has 2 representatives from each state instead of being responsive to population. And that's pretty much that. The plan will be to pass a constitutional amendment because right now it's in the Constitution that we have a Senate. So we are going to amend the Constitution in order to abolish the Senate. This will be done through normal ways and means as fast as possible. And then the standard for today's round should be net benefits, as it is indicated by should in the resolution that this is a policy round. So who can ever prove to you at the end of today's round that they are doing the greatest good for the greatest number of people should win today's round. With that, our plan, I already said the plan, we're all good on that. One observation at the top is that having a bicameral legislature, having like the 2 bodies of the Congress that we currently have in the US is not common across many places across the world. So a lot of places that have systems such as Britain, Australia and Canada are able to have just one legislature and they're able to make policy just fine. So that's just something you should know. First contention. Allowing for meaningful legislation. Subpoint A here is gridlock. Essentially, the Senate was created at a time when the Founding Fathers wanted to restrain democracy. They were afraid of what free democracy would mean. In fact, senators were originally appointed, they weren't elected. So they used the Senate to be a check on the sort of radical democratic ideas that they thought would be coming out of the House. Now today, what they call radical democracy, we call equality, fairness, and real democracy. And so the Senate is essentially still sitting there, restraining meaningful democracy from what's happening. 70% of all issues, major issues in the Senate right now, and actually all issues they're talking about, are currently in gridlock. Now what does gridlock mean? Gridlock doesn't mean it's sitting there being debated, we're talking about it, we're trying to figure out what to do. Gridlock means literally nothing is happening. Nobody is talking, these issues are just sitting on the table, and nobody can do anything because in the Senate, small minorities can stop big majorities, which means that even if one party controls the House, controls the Senate, and controls the executive branch, a minority party can block legislation in the Senate. This is done through a couple different ways. The first is going to be the filibuster. The filibuster allows minority parties to essentially block a vote from happening. It has been used time and time again by members of the Senate to stop any kind of legislation from happening, and it is unique to the Senate. It's something that most senators, actually, according to the New York Times, are in favor of getting rid of, because it's something that literally makes the Senate completely unfunctional. But it's not the only way that that happens. There's other ways that essentially through like backwoods lobbying and things like that, that minorities are able to stop votes by the majority in the Senate. So filibustering is not the only problem there. So point B here is going to be that the Senate causes gridlock. So the reason for that, as I mentioned, is that this policy originates typically in the House. And so policy is made there and tested and debated and passed and sent on to the Senate for the approval. And that is where the gridlock comes from. Because the Senate is able to just stop policy in its tracks, which means that we aren't seeing meaningful policy being made on a number of huge issues that are affecting everyday Americans. Essentially, we see legislation left in gridlock on things like Medicare, on things like immigration, that is allowing people to literally lose their lives because a couple of men in suits in Washington can't get it together to make a decision. And that is happening primarily because the Senate exists, because it allows for this kind of blocking. And we cannot allow for that to continue happening. Our second contention is giving more power to the people. So once again, a little background. Originally, when the Senate was made, the United States was a loose federation of states. It was thought that unless we gave each state equal say, we would separate, we would break apart, we were too different. That is not the United States we see today. Since then, 37 new states have been added, and we see an America that is far more united in many ideologies and across state lines than it was before. There are like divisions, but they aren't on state lines, they're typically on party lines or on other things. So with that, our first subpoint here is going to be big states. So right now, states, using California as an example, which has a population of roughly 40 million people, which is more than the 20 smallest states' populations combined, are represented equally to each of those states, which means small states are able to block and bully legislation in the Senate easily, simply because they have representation there, despite the fact that they represent a fraction of Americans. That isn't fair. We shouldn't have a system where less Americans have more impact, because we live in a democracy, which means the will of the people, not the will of the people who happen to live how things should be. Subpoint 2, or B, I don't remember if I use letters or numbers here, is going to be that of race. So right now, what we can see is because these small states are vastly overrepresented, these small states also happen to be majority white. We see that people of color live predominantly in states that are number 1 larger and number 2 in metropolitan areas which exist more in larger states. Which means that we see that the power of white Americans who are fast slipping away as being the majority is vastly overrepresented in the Senate. We shouldn't have a system that favors one race simply on the virtue of where people are born and where they live. We should have a system that represents all Americans equally, and the Senate is currently standing in the way of that. The impacts here are we can see that we significantly hurt democracy through the Senate because it means that we don't have the actual will of the people happening. We aren't able to make meaningful legislation, as I mentioned before, but more importantly, any legislation that is passed isn't actually representative of what people want, which means we have a broken system. We do not have a democracy. We are not upholding the basic tenets of the United States. We are suppressing the votes of some, and specifically, we're suppressing the votes of people, the voices of people of color, which should never be allowed because it allows for more discrimination against those people, more acts that encourage violence against those people, and all of these things that shouldn't be allowed in our democratic system. Our third and final contention is going to be better legislation. So subpoint A here is more uniform policies. Currently, we will have, so if with the abolition of the Senate, we will have more policies being made on a federal level, which means that we are going to see policies that affect across the board. Instead of the current loopholes we have where companies can go to one state to get a tax break and go to another to get something else, we want to have a more uniform policy across the board. Subpoint B here is going to be more accurate representation. Because the Senate has representation based on the House has representation where you can represent a smaller group of people and more accurately represents America. We can look at Texas and California as examples. California is represented in the Senate by Democrats, but California has large portions that are Republican. Those people should have their voice, they should have their say. Same with Texas, they have large portions that are Democrat, and that's completely ignored in the Senate. The Senate takes one state and says you are red or you are blue for the most part, and that's not something that we want to continue happening. We want to stamp that out and allow for better policy to be made because these representatives are working closer with individuals, they know their individuals and what their constituents need a lot better, which means better legislation is made on balance. So for all those reasons, we strongly urge the USFG should abolish the Senate.
So I'm going to go over my case and then their case. All in order.
Actually, hold on, we have a delivery.
This is open quarters, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so just give these to the non-index.
Wait, and then we got walked over.
Okay.
You can pick them up.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so I think you guys go to how we should list it out. But
Everyone ready? Yeah. Begin my time now. My partner and I negate today's resolution that the United States should abolish the Senate. Let's get right into our arguments. The first disadvantage on the plan is backlash. The first point here is that Republicans have control in the Senate right now. They themselves say that the Senate is a key stronghold for Republicans, and this is where they derive a lot of their power in the federal government. According to the USA Today, Senate has been a historical stronghold for Republicans, and it's very important to them. In addition, Republicans are desperate for power because we see in an increasingly polarized system, they are fighting basically a culture war against what they perceive as massive change in this country. Next, you look to the second point here. According to the Washington Post, extremism is at a high. Extreme ideals are increasingly represented within the Republican Party. What we're seeing is asymmetric polarization. The Democratic Party has gotten slightly more liberal over the past 2 decades, but the Republican Party has gotten significantly more conservative. We see this with the election of Donald Trump, who's significantly more conservative than past Republican presidents. We see that within the Republican Party, Republican extremism has become normalized according to the Washington Monthly. You look to the fact that Republican House representatives are openly calling for civil war. I'm referring to Steve King. We look to the fact that Donald Trump himself has tweeted about the fact that people should be taking up arms against these different democratic legislations. What we see is that the Republican Party has become incredibly radicalized. So what happens when they abolish the Senate, an institution that has existed in the United States for 250 years and has been a traditional stronghold of power for the Republican Party? This is not going to go over smoothly. But even more than that, it's going to cause massive violence and backlash. We already see this in the status quo. Even the Department of Homeland Security, headed by a Trump appointee, said that the biggest threat facing the United States is domestic white supremacy and domestic extremism. We see that even the Department of Homeland Security says that these extremist groups are what we should be worried about. And this is not some sort of abstract lone wolf things. We look to the fact that the FBI has tracked and arrested militia groups in New Mexico, Arizona, Oregon, Washington, Montana, Alabama, Mississippi. These are all states where evangelical and radical conservative militias have been formed, and they are taking action. For example, this year in Oregon, when the Democratic legislature proposed a climate change bill, the Republican legislators literally shut it down and fled to literally hide in the rural counties of Oregon with the conservative militia. That actually happened in the real world. So we see is these militias exist. So what is going to happen when you take away one of the Republicans' biggest sources of power is that these people are going to start retaliating. These people are going to start committing domestic acts of terror. We see that already, even on small stuff, even on small investigations, it has riled up the populace this much. If you're fundamentally changing the United States government so much that you're abolishing an entire body of legislature, what we're going to see is massive backlash against this. We're in such a polarized time right now that taking extreme action like this will catapult us into conflict. And Judge, we're going to see that that is clearly worse than the world that they're portraying. Because they're going to give us a more polarized America. An America where violence is the norm. An America where people are turned against each other, and a polarized, radicalized conservative party will basically lead to civil war. Okay, now let's go on to the second disadvantage, which is basically about how increasing the House power is bad. You can look to our first subpoint here about the recent Supreme Court decision, which basically said that there can be no federal regulation on gerrymandering for House districts. They basically gave all the power to states to regulate. The B subpoint is that internal state legislatures have the ultimate say in deciding House districts. So they are giving ultimate power to a body of legislature that is completely controlled by internal state legislatures. Why is this a problem? The C subpoint is that Republicans control far more of the state legislatures. We see that it's 45% versus 29% in terms of Republican controlled state legislatures, with 13 divided states. And this is just small rural states like Arkansas or Iowa. These are big states. This is Texas, this is Florida, this is Georgia, this is North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan. They don't just have one body, they have the trifecta. They control what we do with these House districts. And the recent Supreme Court decision gives them unique power to go all in on gerrymandering and destroy the say of minorities. What we see is that you can actually turn a lot of their impacts in today's debate round, because the recent Supreme Court decision gives full control to state legislatures that are primarily Republican. What we will see is that these states will be deciding who goes to the federal government. With the Senate, it's just a popular vote within the state. It's not gerrymandered, you can't affect it. But if you go to states like North Carolina or Wisconsin, they managed to rig it so much that 67% of the vote gave 30% of the seats. That is what the House is becoming in the status quo, and that is what they are giving power to. Okay, now let's go onto the App case. Okay, so their first contention is about gridlock. They give this speech about how this was an outdated system from the Founding Fathers, how they were afraid of free democracy, real democracy. No, the reason this came about is because there were two sects in our country. States that didn't want, slave states, that wanted to have representation within this. Now, Why did they not do this? Not because they wanted to give concessions to slavery, but because they knew that the United States of America could not exist unless both sides got together. We are not defending radical conservatives. We are not defending any Republicans. What we're saying is that this system exists as a check on balances. I'll take it at the end of that time. Look to the UN Security Council. We have veto power because that provides a balanced system. We haven't had a war between major powers in the world because that veto system makes sure that it doesn't happen. It's the same thing in the United States system. This provides a check back. And I agree with you. A lot of these policies that they're advocating for are bad. But the reality is that what they're doing is destroying the entire system, and turning half of the country against them is even worse. Okay, you look down to all this stuff about how they're talking about the filibuster, and they're talking about lobbying. If the filibuster and lobbying are the problems with the Senate, then reform the Senate. Don't just completely get rid of an institution that serves as a balance on our legislature. Why we should get rid of filibuster and pass campaign finance reform instead of just abolishing the Senate. Again, they talk about how the Senate causes all of this gridlock. Again, we turn this in two ways. We outweigh on all this violence that's going to come from this, and we also outweigh on the fact that the House is going to be favoring Republican legislatures anyway. Next, they talk about how they're creating power for the people. They're talking about this loose federation of states. They say that now we're a much more united country, and so this system will work. No, we are a much more polarized country than ever before. Ever since the Civil War, this is the most polarized we have been. You can look at the fact that I tell you this is asymmetrical polarization, and Republicans will be checking back in extremely violent ways. And again, they're trying to give power to the people, but they're investing power in state legislatures to decide where these districts are drawn. So if you look to a state like North Carolina, they've drawn their districts such that minorities have far less representation than white voters. And we see that this creates a system that has much worse problems than they're talking about. Next, under their third contention, we're going to talk about better legislation. So I say, this is basically just impacts to all of their arguments. And at the point where we show you that we, one, outweigh on violence coming from extremists, and two, they are actually making the system worse by investing power in a biased system, we show you that we outweigh all of their impacts. And for those reasons, they're strong about litigation.
Started. I think we're going through the relations case first, and I'll move to the application order. Sound good? Getting right into it. Their first point is about backlash. Now, they try to say that right now the Republicans hold the Senate, and basically if we take this stronghold from them, independent white militia, white supremacist groups are going to terrorize the entire country and cause mass hatred of things. Several responses to this. First response. The people he's talking about, the massive extremists, are the people who are screaming the loudest, but they are not the greatest in number. The overwhelming majority of Americans are not radical extremists who are going to kill other Americans over the elimination of a house in the legislature. People are not that caring, that extreme. So it's not like it's going to happen on a widespread chaos. Don't believe the massive amounts of domestic terrorism they're trying to call for. We're not going to be seeing that level of radical destruction. Second response to this is also going to be the areas in which you see the most radical, like white supremacy or like militias, whatever domestic terrorist groups they want to claim exist, are going to be the areas that are most secluded, that are the most conservative, that are the most already white-centric and independent areas, meaning that you're not going to be seeing these militias in the heart of white Ohio killing or harming minority groups because there aren't minority groups there. You're not going to be seeing that happening. You're not going to have white militias in Silicon Valley murdering minorities because that's not where the militia groups are. So you don't believe this level of domestic terrorism where they try to act like the whole country is going to happen in some sort of civilian civil war. Third response to this is that with House control of the entire system, we're seeing a situation in which we can pass a lot more legislation to protect people of color, women, minorities in general, from like hate crimes and from all this kind of stuff. So we're pushing forward a lot of legislation that can help put limits on like gun control, and we can start pushing forward other methods that can help protect people who are otherwise unprotected. So we actually see that not only would this like help cancel out whatever short-term effects, if any, that would actually occur, but we also lead to long-term solvency for a lot of these issues, which otherwise would not resolve. Even if you have like 1 year of massive, sporadic, horrible terrorist attacks that the next side would claim like in the best of their world, which isn't going to happen. But even if that were to occur, you're definitely outweighed by like the hundreds of thousands of like gun deaths that happen every year in America for the foreseeable future in the status quo where we have the Senate blocking any and all gun reform. So all of those deaths are going to completely outweigh any sort of short-term impact that they're going to try to throw on us. Also, we have a moral response to this too, which is that if your only response to a solid, amazing, like you believe that's a good change to abolish the Senate and it's a good thing for our nation, if the only response to that is, oh, we're afraid of what the people who disagree with us are going to do, you're like constantly going to be like stopping important change from occurring in this country. It's going to be impossible to have good, meaningful change to protect and help Americans without making the small minority unhappy. And if you're going to let that stop you at every turn, you're never going to have meaningful change in America, which means you're still going to have kids in cages on the border, you're still going to have people getting killed in high schools, and you're still going to have all these issues that are extremely serious and extremely important that need to be dealt with now are still going to be happening and having negative impacts. So we completely disagree with this. With that, we're also going to touch on the point lightly about a polarized America. We're saying that yes, there is a slightly polarized America, but banning the Senate is actually going to depolarize America more, because it means in the House you're going to have more discussions, because they know if you're a Republican in the House, you know the Senate isn't going to just block the bill. So you actually have to cooperate and work with House Democrats in order to try to make the bill best for you, which means that instead of just seeing a bunch of bills passed by the House that are like strong left-leaning and then just stopped in the Senate, you have bills that are more balanced and outweighed and discussed by both parties that are leading the House and that are passing into law. In addition, people who are radicals, just touching back on this, is that people who are radicals, individuals, are usually motivated by like specific issues that they have, like hate-based issues or issues like immigration. This is like a change in like political systems. Not many people in militia groups are overall concerned about the state of affairs in the Senate. They're just upset if you want to take their guns from them. They're not going to be concerned by like something like that. Like it's not the same level of immediate knee-jerk gut reaction that these people are going to feel this massive anger against from this versus a bunch of other policies that have already like been motivated. And then the second response is that people are going to adapt to this new system regardless. So you're also going to be seeing like some sort of return to the normal status quo if we even have any response whatsoever. With that, we'll move on to their second point of increasing House power.
Not totally the status quo.
Not totally status quo, but of increasing the House power being bad. So basically, they say that with gerrymandering being on the rise, you're going to see the House become like unfairly represented. The first response is that the House is still much more representative than the Senate is, because basically they didn't respond at all to a third contention. So you can cross-apply step point B here, which is that when you have like many more people, you're able to better represent a state, just like California doesn't have any like Republican senators, and like Texas doesn't have any Democratic senators, when in reality there's a lot of nuances in both of those states. So you're still seeing better representation in the House. Secondly, even if the Supreme Court has ruled like right now that you can't immediately solve for gerrymandering, if we have the House able to pass more legislation, you're increasing the odds of at least mitigating the damages of gerrymandering in the future, where you have none of that solvency whatsoever in the neg world, because the Senate is able to block any sort of resolve that's doing that. So in the neg world, if you're trying to solve for gerrymandering whatsoever, you have both the block of this Supreme Court decision, but you also have the block of the Senate, which is in the favor of the Republicans to block gerrymandering solving legislature. Whereas in the world of the app, even if you take into account the Supreme Court ruling, you don't have the Senate there to block that. So you're much more likely to solve for gerrymandering. You're much more likely to pass legislation that helps represent people in a world where the app where we get rid of the Senate. And then state regulation of gerrymandering is also like a possibility, because we know that all the Supreme Court decision tells us is that that we can't be regulated on a federal level, but we know that Democrats have been getting closer and closer to winning over red states every year. During the midterms, there was many states that have been historically like red for decades and decades that were like almost won over by Democrats. So it's not like this is an impossible long-term thing where it's going to be gerrymandering forever. This is also solvable. Moving on to the government case. Our first point is about meaningful legislation and gridlock. Now, basically, they respond to this by just saying that, oh, well, we need the checks and balances, and you can do things like removing the filibuster. First, on the filibuster response, any reform to the Senate cannot pass because by definition, the minorities in the Senate will block it from passing. So the only way to actually affect change would be to like remove the Senate entirely. Because if you try to pass any filibuster legislation, the people who filibuster who don't like it are going to filibuster. You have such a level of gridlock that we can't even fix the problems that we have in our nation. We can't even fix the problems that cause the problems because of this like deep entrenchment of like a lack of actual functional legislation. Secondly, we still have checks and balances. The classic checks and balances that every like high schooler learns about in their gov class, and that's like often referred to, is between the branches of government. You don't necessarily need a bicameral legislature to have those checks and balances. We still have the executive veto to check on the legislative branch. The legislative branch can still check on like the presidential branch because the president can't just pass things on their own, and you still have judicial review on the Supreme Court. All the checks and balances are in place. So you actually have a much better way. In fact, we'd actually argue that checks and balances are better enforced with the removal of the Senate, because when the Senate is engaged, we have things like the blocking of Supreme Court justices by the Senate, which is completely unconstitutional and just destroys the checks and balances we have in place. And without the Senate there, that kind of thing can't happen. So we're seeing better use of those original principles. Our second point is about power to the people and better representing Americans. The only response here is that we're more polarized than we've ever been. First response is no, we haven't. We had a situation in our country where we had half the country literally willing to own other people as slaves, and the other half was like not willing to do that. We had a civil war. So you're not seeing it's the most polarized. Secondly, we're not polarized along state lines. We're polarized against party lines, which means that you have people in states that are polar opposites, but it doesn't mean that the individual states are against each other in the same way. So it's important to more look at those people rather than just look at the states, which is why we don't like the Senate. Finally, there's absolutely no response to our third point of better legislation, which is perhaps one of the most important points in today's debate, because if we don't accurately represent the people, what is the point of democracy in general? So for all these reasons, the United States should abolish the Senate. Thank you.
So for my speech, I will stick to like the order we've been going through here this entire round. The neg case, there are 2 disadvantages in order, and then my opponent's case, there are 3 advantages in order. With that, is anyone not ready to begin? Start time now. My opponents advocate for a world where they take away the Republican Party's entire stronghold and all of their influence in the United States government, pushing them over the brink, pushing them over the brink and pushing extremism further and further. First, they talk about how super extremists have the greatest voice, but it doesn't mean they're the greatest threat. Counterpoint to this, look to Nazi Germany. The Nazis represented 2% of the population, but they were still able to kill 6 million Jews. Small groups, while they may be small, they still can have a large impact. We see that the point where they can see the fact that the Department of Homeland Security literally said that the greatest threat to American security is domestic extremism and terrorism is the point at which they lose, because they literally concede the fact that the Republican Party is increasing in extremism. And what's happening as a result of this is terrorism is increasing. This is the greatest threat. It is not something we can ignore and not something we can take lightly. Second, sorry, I'll take it at the end of this point, guys. Second, they talk about how there are like areas where there are areas where there's already white-centric militias and how there's like no minorities here. This is completely objectively false. They give this false narrative that minorities only exist in coastal cities. This is absolutely ridiculous. Minorities exist throughout the country. While they may be more prevalent in other areas, they still exist there. And they are ignoring the lives of all minorities who live in rural states or areas that are near these militias. And they're essentially saying that these lives are wasted and that we don't want to do anything to protect them. We as the negation protect those minorities. Third, they talk about how they can pass legislation to protect minorities. What's the point of protecting minorities if you're just going to gamble their lives and say that these militias can run rampant? They're pushing these militias into a corner so that they will end up, they're poking the bear. They're literally causing an increase in attacks. And they're saying, oh, our justification is we're going to try and protect minorities in the long run. But what about all the lives we advocate for right now? There is no point in being such an extreme measure to take away the Republicans' entire stronghold when we can just reform it or do other things like that. There is absolutely no need because of the cost of lives. Next, they talk about how it stops, like, they talk about how it, like, stops good ideas. This is essentially, like, their third contention about how it would pass better policies, but they say how this, like, so I will address this then. Next, fifth, they talk about how this decreases polarization because it increases discussion in the House. This is absolutely ridiculous. We see that discussion is not actually like a solvency for polarization. Polarization still exists. The fact of which they can see the fact that if you take away their entire stronghold, extremism is going to increase. That is the basic fact. You literally take away all of their power, they want power, they are going to be upset. That is the fundamental fact. Sure.
Isn't it true that the Republicans controlled the House up until about 1 to 2 years ago now?
Okay, well, first of all, it's not accurate in the grand scheme of things. Just because they controlled the House once doesn't mean that in the course of history they controlled. Sorry, I just answered the POI. I want another. Just because they controlled the House in this previous example, we cite USA Today in our first speech is also goes conceded. The fact that throughout the majority of history, the Republicans do not control the House. Why? This is because they're simply like a minority. They just, like, literally the crux of their entire argument is that the Republicans are like a minority and that they're only is like an unrepresentative because they have so much voice in the Senate. Now, six, they talk about how radicals are concerned with one issue. Sure, let's pretend that this is true for a moment. Even if they're only concerned with this one issue, it is completely false that they won't be upset that the one method or the one area where their issue can be represented, the Senate, is taken away. The fact that there is no Senate means that they can't have solvency for this issue. So if they care about immigration or gun control, and if we take away the Republicans' main vessel to convey their ideas, they are still going to be upset. They are part of this group. They are sticking strong to their ideals, and they will not be okay with this. Next, they talk about how people will, like, adapt to this. How many lives, Judge? I ask, how many lives have to be lost before people adapt? This is absolutely ridiculous. We can't be pushing this, we can't be poking the bear. We can't be allowing them to run rampant. We can't be allowing extremism to increase when there are much better alternatives. We also, the fact is we can't be allowing extremism to increase because of all the lives that are at stake. Which is why they say when people will adapt, at what cost, Judge? On to our second contention about how the House power is bad. They talk about how the House is like more representative of the people. This is again representation, so we will address that on that argument. But furthermore, they talk about how it will impact the later it will impact the arguments of gerrymandering. So in their last speech, they're probably going to go for the impacts that they are solving things in the long term, that they are creating resolutions. First, this is a double line. Either the Democrats have so much power in the House to the point where they can pass all of their legislation, which means extremism is going to increase massively because the Republican Party, who represents a significant portion of America, has no method of their voice being heard. They have no representation. They have no say in our democracy. Just because they're a minority doesn't mean that they shouldn't be heard and have their views expressed. This is absolutely false. The other scenario is that the Republicans do have a voice in the House. They do have a voice, which means they literally create no solvency. Why? Because they're just saying that these state legislators are going to be passing better legislation, but they actually don't articulate this because Republicans can again override it. Also, they talk about how state regulation is, quote, possible. Okay, first of all, if state regulation is possible, why don't we see that happening right now? Second thing is, I'm sorry, I'll address that. Sorry, I have a lot to get through still, so please ask me again. The second thing is we that they say state regulation is possible. What we notice is that a lot of like Republican areas and Republican states aren't going to legislate this, or aren't going to regulate this, which means in Republican states and Republican areas, the Republicans are still going to have control. They are still going to have they're still going to have power in the House. They're still going to gerrymander and exploit the minorities in their area. This is critical, Judge, because the minorities that live in rural communities, those are the ones that they do nothing to help. So they will only turn this monster of these Republican extremists, they will only turn them on these minorities and gamble with all of their lives. Next, they talk about how Democrats won red states in this election. This is objectively false. These were swing states. These were not red states. So because of this, it's completely false that the Democrats are actually winning over these Republicans. If anything, the Republicans are getting more extremist. On to my opponent's first contention. They talk about how good legislation can be passed and gridlock. They give very little ink in response to what my partner says. The reason why there was polarization before, they say it's slaves. They say it's slave states, and that's why there was polarization. But what we see is my partner clearly articulates the fact that this is after the Civil War. After the Civil War, our polarization is increasing massively. It's not on the decline. Now, also they say that we can, checks and balances still exist. Yes, they do. But just guess what? These checks and balances, none of them work for the minority. None of them work for the political minority. These Republicans cannot actually express their ideology in the Senate because the Senate is literally gone. They don't have any other checks and balances that work for minorities. Why? Because you take away the vessel that gives them representation. That is literally the purpose of the Senate, Judge. Now, furthermore, they talk about how we can't pass reform because the minority in the Senate won't won't want to override the filibuster. First, we advocate for working for a solution, for actually talking to the Republican Party and creating a solution that works for them to the point. Sorry, for TikTok. Working for a solution that will actually create change and won't cause Republican extremism. That's what we are trying to avoid. They completely don't address the fact that extremism is going to increase, or is going to be a very big problem. Now, they talk about how it's going to give power to the people. Again, I've already refuted this point about 50%. It's not going to give power to the people because of gerrymandering. Also, their third contention about better legislation. Again, Judge, there are much better ways we can achieve this without gambling with all of these people's lives. Thank you.
So I'm basically going to do the two disads, and then some, kind of an overview at the end. Is everyone ready? Give my time now. Judges, you're voting for us for two reasons. The first is the first disadvantage about violence and backlash. They have three main responses to this. The first is to say, these people are a minority, but even they admit they are a loud voice. They don't speak with their voices, they speak with their guns. They are the main cause of terrorism in this country, and Homeland Security has said that they are the biggest threat out of everything to this country. We see that minorities can have an outsized impact. My partner gives you the great example of Nazi Germany, where a small minority caused incredible oppression. The second response they give you is that, they won't be motivated by this. It's just a political change, and people are motivated by issues like immigration and other stuff, and gun control and stuff like that. But the entire point of their case is they're trying to pass immigration law. They're trying to pass healthcare reform. They're trying to pass gun control. And if you believe that any of that will even be proposed or advanced, then they're conceding that these people will be motivated. The entire reason they are motivated by this change in the political system is because it means that none of their views will be represented. The reason that the Senate blocks so many bills is because their constituents do not agree with them. That is the entire point of the bicameral legislature, because it allows differing views to counterbalance each other. The third thing is that they say, it won't be that big of a deal, the violence won't be that big. Again, Homeland Security says this is the biggest threat to its country, but don't just believe words, believe actions. You can look around the country. In the past couple years, the amount of domestic terrorism has increased a ton. I give you tons of examples of militias that actually exist. I give you examples of Republican politicians that have called for civil war and for totally minor legislative disputes. If you literally take away their office, are you kidding me? You think they'll just stand by and not call upon supporters that are at the ready? No. Judge, the impacts of this is what you are voting on in this round, because this is massive scale violence against the very people that they're trying to help. This is ripping this country apart. We can't make progress when you're discarding the views of 50% of our population. That is not how democracy works. The second reason you're voting for us is because the House has an imbalanced power dynamic now. The first point here is about the Supreme Court decision. They say that, the House can legislate on this. They didn't rule on legislature. They ruled on the Constitution. Baked into our Constitution, they have decided that states have the ultimate power. This gives them free reign. So the House districts, what they want is completely controlled by the state legislatures. They can control who you are allowed to vote for. And they concede the fact that Republicans control an outsized proportion of state legislatures versus the Senate, which you cannot gerrymander. Demographic change, everything about how Democrats may be gaining ground, that helps more in the Senate because you cannot shift it. And again, this hurts minorities more.
The argument that changing,
Demographic
change happens more and affects more in the Senate is completely new and shouldn't be made in the third
Drop it.
speech.
Yeah, drop it. All right, next. Again, this hurts minorities more and negates all of their impacts, because we show you that putting this power to the House because of the gerrymandering decision does not help minorities and does not help liberals. Judges, at the end of the day, we're telling you two simple stories. The first is about our republic. We do not get to choose who is in our country. The entire reason we have the governmental system we have is because the founding fathers recognized that people have different views. We don't get to just break the system and deny 50% of the country from their views and their representation just because we disagree with them. That is how you destroy democracy, and that is how you cause civil war and incredible backlash. The second story we're telling you is that even if you don't buy that, they are not solving for any of the problems that they bring up. They are investing power in a legislature that is dominated by internal state legislatures that are controlled by Republicans and will gerrymander minorities out of power regardless. So for those two reasons, because we outweigh and none of their impacts will happen, I urge a strong vote in litigation.
Cool, just voters, not crazy. Okay, so I first want to point out that their entire case sits in a double bind. Either we believe them when they tell us...
The analysis that our entire case sits in a double bind is completely new. When we laid out both of our disadvantages throughout our speeches, you could have counted it in your second speech.
Let me rephrase and put it in the words that my partner did. Their analysis about how the House will be controlled by Republicans or the Senate will be controlled by Republicans puts them in a double bind. This is what my partner articulated. Essentially, what they want us to believe is both that the only stronghold for the Republicans lies in the Senate and that the Senate control the House through gerrymandering. Which is it? They cannot win both because they put themselves in a double bind there. So, with that, our voters. Our first voting issue is going to be representing the people. First of all, we see that big states are vastly overrepresented. This is completely conceded them. They concede that we are getting nothing done in the status quo because we do not have equal representation and that we have big states vastly overrepresented, which means we do not have democracy. Long-term, not having a democracy should outweigh everything else, because if our democracy falls apart, then we lose the ability to check backs for the freedoms and for any kind of anarchy and violence long-term. Secondly, we want to talk about how white people are vastly overrepresented in the Senate. This, again, goes completely conceded by our opponents, which means they agree that we have a system that is overrepresenting white people and allowing them to create legislation that targets people of color and allows for the targeting of people of color, which means they are prolonging the lives that are being lost right now. Gee, I wonder why we have a situation where there's extremism. Probably because there aren't those diverse views in the Senate or being represented by the Senate to protect people. So we can clearly see
the idea that the reason extremism exists is because there's no diversity in the Senate is completely insufficient.
I'll drop it. But the point is here that we are allowing for the continuation and the victimization of people of color because of the Senate. The only real response they have here is backlash, their only example being Hitler. A couple responses here because they made this during their night walk. First of all, there's a logical fallacy called the Hitler fallacy. If you can only find justification for your argument in Hitler, you're probably wrong. Secondly, Hitler happened through a top-down system. It happened because Hitler was in power. These extremists are not in power, which means we're not going to see the same thing happen that happened in Nazi Germany. It's completely ludicrous. So dismiss that completely. But let's talk about backlash actually. What would really happen? What we would see is that there isn't going to be the kind of backlash they assert. Number one, judges gut check this. Are we really going to see every individual in America take up arms against their neighbor because the Senate is dissolved? No, many Americans are against the gridlock that's been happening for years. Secondly, they talk about how we are going to see like small pockets speak with a loud voice. We explain that we check for that long term by having actual meaningful gun legislation being made on these issues. We are losing people every day, extremists or not, to gun violence because the Senate has blocked any meaningful gun legislation for decades, which means that long term, more lives are lost in a world in which we continue to have the Senate, even if you believe there's going to be some loss of life because of backlash. But it's unlikely that happens anyways because they concede our analysis, which is that when we say that extremists are interested in issues they can understand, they aren't going to be interested in this issue, which just looks like we have one less legislature, one less House in the legislature, but it's not a partisan decision. It's just something that is affecting the total function or the overall function of the government, which means they're not going to react the way that they assert they will, and they concede this completely. So let's get into our second voting issue, which is that of better legislation. This has to be the most important impact in today's round, because better legislation happens for the rest of the existence of the United States, and they concede that better legislation happens when we do not have the gridlock we have right now. At the point where they agree that our system is broken, and the only justification they have for not doing something is that we have a slight chance that there is some form of backlash, that is not enough. The problem for them here is that we outweigh on both probability and magnitude. If there is even a chance that we do not see massive backlash long term, which again, gut shot, that is most definitely what's going to happen, then the magnitude of the impacts that we bring you outweigh. And even if there is a chance that something happens, the magnitude outweighs long term. They concede that long term legislation will lead to less issues, less victimization of minorities, and more equality in the United States of America. Secondly, we talk about the representation of the people and the fact that we don't have a democracy right now. We can fix a lot of the issues, a lot of the extremism, a lot of things they talk about through representation of people, but they concede that's not happening explicitly because of the Senate. The only real response they have here is when they talk about gerrymandering. But once again, they put themselves in a double bind here by conceding in their nay block and telling us that in fact gerrymandering isn't going to be an issue, because my partner points out that a lot of states are growing in their legislators to become more and more democratic, and a lot of states that were typically Republican are becoming more democratic, and they concede that that means that that would likely check back for gerrymandering long term. They also concede that strides are being made in state legislatures to regulate gerrymandering in the status quo. But even so, what's most important here is that we outweigh long term in probability and magnitude, because abolishing the Senate allows for the stopping of the loss of life that is happening right now. Do not let them dissuade us from making meaningful policy action on fear-mongering. We need to take action. For all those reasons, I encourage abolishing the Senate.
Rich, shake your hand, I'm sick right now.
They're both.
Yeah, there we go.
So,